Psychological analysis of Rebecca. Daphne du Maurier's Rebecca is not just a Gothic masterpiece but also a profound psychological study of its three central characters, the unnamed narrator, Maxim de Winter, and Mrs. Danvers. Each character exhibits behaviors and symptoms that reflect their inner struggles with trauma, identity, and obsession. 1. The unnamed narrator. The unnamed narrator is the novel's central character and the lens through which the story unfolds. Her lack of a name underscores her fragile sense of identity, as she constantly compares herself to Rebecca, Maxim's first wife. Low self-esteem. The narrator is deeply insecure, seeing herself as inferior and unworthy of her role as mistress of Manderley. She feels overshadowed by Rebecca's lingering presence and legacy. Anxiety and social awkwardness. She exhibits symptoms of social anxiety, often second-guessing her words and actions. Her inner monologue is filled with self-doubt and catastrophic thinking. Imposter syndrome. The narrator feels like she doesn't belong at Manderley, struggling to live up to Rebecca's perceived perfection. This leads to submissive and self-sabotaging behaviors, such as avoiding confrontation and apologizing excessively. Her psychological struggles stem from her youth and inexperience, as well as her lack of a supportive upbringing. Over the course of the novel, she evolves from a timid, self-effacing woman to someone who confronts her fears and begins to assert her identity. 2. Maxim de Winter. Maxim is a deeply conflicted character whose actions and demeanor reflect symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, repression, and moral dissonance. PTSD. Maxim is haunted by the events surrounding Rebecca's death. His avoidance of her name and his tense reactions to reminders of her suggest unresolved trauma. Repression. Maxim buries his emotions and the truth about his relationship with Rebecca, creating a barrier between himself and the narrator. This repression manifests in his aloofness and occasional bursts of anger. Moral dissonance. Maxim's guilt over Rebecca's death conflicts with his relief at being free from her manipulative control. This inner turmoil contributes to his inability to connect emotionally with those around him. Maxim's psychological state reveals the devastating effects of secrets and unresolved guilt, making him both a tragic and morally ambiguous figure. 3. Mrs. Danvers. Mrs. Danvers is the embodiment of obsession and grief, displaying behaviors that suggest fixation, dependency, and maladaptive coping mechanisms. Obsessive behavior. Her idolization of Rebecca borders on pathological. She preserves Rebecca's room as a shrine and manipulates others to maintain Rebecca's dominance, even in death. Dependency. Mrs. Danvers' identity is entirely tied to Rebecca. Without her, she feels purposeless, which fuels her destructive actions. Maladaptive coping. Unable to process her grief healthily, she channels it into manipulation and revenge, ultimately leading to her self-destructive actions, including the burning of Manderley. Psychological themes in Rebecca. The novel explores universal psychological themes such as identity, trauma, and power dynamics. Identity and comparison. The narrator's struggle to define herself outside of Rebecca's shadow highlights the dangers of comparison and the importance of self-acceptance. Trauma and secrecy. Maxim's repression and Mrs. Danvers' obsessive grief demonstrate how unresolved trauma can destroy relationships and lives. Memory and legacy. Rebecca's memory exerts psychological control over the living characters, illustrating how the past can shape and haunt the present. Rebecca remains a compelling psychological study, with its characters serving as reflections of human fears, insecurities, and desires.